Erev Tov, good evening, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Tuesday Night Learning at the Shaar. This is the bonus session. This is a semester, a series of evenings that we planned only after we heard your response to our fall semester, which was our first semester on Zoom, and only as we've come to understand that these new realities present opportunities for engagement, for outreach, for learning. As the days become shorter, as we're now in the period of the long Montreal nights, there's a teaching in the Talmud that says that study at night is given the reward of loving kindness during the day. And the reason that nighttime study is rewarded in such a way is because traditionally what happens during the day is seen as a time of obligation. You do what you have to. In the day we take care of the errands. In the day we go to work and we do what must be done. But at night, that's when the discretionary activities start. That's when we make the decision, what do I want to do tonight? Do I want to sit and read a book? Do I want to spend time with people I love? Do I want to watch Netflix? What am I going to do tonight? And because night is seen as such a time of discretionary activity, that's why the reward for using this time in a productive way is so great. And it's in that spirit that we present this evening of Tuesday Night Learning and the next few weeks, because we're presenting a program of engagement and learning. And as the nights get longer, we're recommitting to learning, to engaging, to bringing the Shaar to you, and to bringing our community closer together. It's my pleasure to now call upon Professor Rosalie Jukier to introduce this evening's guest.
Thank you, Rabbi, and good evening, everyone. I am delighted to introduce and speak with our amazing guest tonight, Justice Rosalie Abella. I should own up at the very start that I am married to Louis Dobrin, who is the co-chair of Tuesday Night Learning and the organizer of tonight's event. And that, yes, nepotism put me in this enviable position that I find myself in. You can well imagine that there were many others who would have wanted to be in my shoes as the interlocutor with Justice Abella, but I feel very lucky that the distinct pleasure falls to me. Justice Rosalie Abella has an amazing personal story. She was born in a DP camp in Germany to her parents, Fanny and Jacob Silberman, Holocaust survivors, on, of all days, July 1st, which turned out to be very prescient as a birthday, given that she would, as a very young child, emigrate to Canada. And it meant that she would forever share her birthday with that of her family's adopted country. Her academic and musical aptitude was clear from the start. And with the encouragement of her wonderful parents, Rosalie Abella graduated from the Royal Conservatory of Music and Classical Piano, as well as with a law degree from the University of Toronto. The latter accomplishment fulfilled her lifelong dream of becoming a lawyer, a profession her father had earned in Poland, but could not practice in Canada, and a goal that she had set out for herself at just 4 years of age. What followed her graduation from U of T Law in 1970 has been nothing short of a miraculous career. Her accomplishments are far too numerous to mention them all in this introduction, so excuse me in advance if I highlight just a few. Those that I will highlight begin in 1976. When, at just 29 and pregnant, Rosalie Abella began her judicial career by being appointed to the Ontario Family Court. Since then, she has chaired the Ontario Labour Relations Board, the Ontario Law Reform Commission, and the Study on Access to Legal Services by the Disabled. She has authored the report of the Federal Royal Commission on Equality in Employment and over 90 scholarly articles. In 1992, she was appointed to the Ontario Court of Appeal, and then elevated to the highest court in our country, the Supreme Court of Canada, in 2004. Many of her accomplishments represent firsts of one kind or another. She was the youngest and first pregnant judge in Canada when she was appointed to the Ontario Family Court, and also the first Jewish woman judge. She was the first to coin the phrase that now rolls off our tongues, employment equity. She was the first woman to chair the Ontario Labour Relations Board and the Ontario Law Reform Commission. She is the first sitting judge to be elected as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, the first Jewish woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court of Canada, and the first Canadian woman to receive an honorary degree from Yale University, which honorary degree is among her 37 at last count. Along the way, Justice Abella, together with her husband, Irving Abella, who she calls Itchy, a recognized historian and scholar in his own right, managed to raise two sons, Jacob and Zachary, of whom I know she is immensely proud. I consider myself blessed to be a friend of Justice Abella. How lucky for me that from 1988 to 1992, she was the Bolton visiting professor at McGill's Faculty of Law, where I have been a professor since 1985. That's where I came to meet her. In 1988, the dean at the time, the late and great Rod MacDonald, someone who was very close to both Justice Abella and myself, was giving her a tour of the faculty when they bumped into me. The dean introduced Justice Abella to me, and when he said my name was Rosalie Jukier, without missing a beat, she said, "Oh, are you a Rosie too?" Here I was, a young academic, being introduced to this powerhouse of a woman judge, and all I could do in my star-struck state was to mutter or stutter, no. The dean then suggested that I continue the tour of the faculty. And I proceeded to take Rosalie Abella up to what we call our common room, which is a spectacular space in what was the main entertaining room of the Ross Mansion, which is our faculty's home. I mentioned this room because not only did Justice Abella remark at the time on what a great space it would make for her son Zachary's bar mitzvah, but it was also the room that was featured as the Dean of Harvard Law's office in the film On the Basis of Sex, a film about one of Justice Abella's true sisters-in-law on the US Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg. I tell these stories to demonstrate that in addition to all her brilliance, commitment, and accomplishment, Justice Rosalie Abella is a wonderful, warm, and charming person. She also has an amazing sense of humor. Once, when we were at a conference together, Justice Abella had a minor wardrobe malfunction. I ran to the concierge to secure a needle and thread, and we proceeded to squish into a bathroom stall together where I fixed her loose seam. When it was done, she thanked me, but added, "You know, Rosalie, I had an easier solution." When I asked what, she responded, "Gum." I know you agree with me that we are in for a treat tonight. So without further ado, I will begin my conversation with the incomparable Rosie Abella. I hope to have some time to take questions from the audience. Please type your questions into the Q&A and keep them short. I know we're all in for a really wonderful evening.
Thank you, Rosalie. It's so great to be here. Welcome all of you to my office at the Supreme Court of Canada. Rosalie, I was so impressed when I met you in 1988 when we were both 10 years old. And it's a joy to be able to say that we're still friends after all these years and still getting to do the things that make us happy with the people like Louis and Itchy that make us happy. So thank you for this. And it is not because you are married to Louis Dobrin that you have this responsibility. It's because I said to Louis Dobrin, I'll do this, but only if Rosalie does the questioning. So I apologize for interfering with your evening, but it's a pleasure to be here and an honor.
All right, thank you so much. So I want to begin tonight's discussion by saying that in some ways we share a similar path to Canada. Like you, my parents were Polish Jews who survived the war, found themselves in DP camps in Germany after the war, and sailed to Canada's Pier 21 in 1950, the same year that you and your family came, although I've checked, not on the same boat. In so many ways, so much of what we become is from where we have come. I know that my family's history has had a profound effect on my life. Maybe we can begin by you telling us the influence it has had on yours.
Well, one of the things that I came to understand much later as I was growing up was how lucky I was. You know, there's a great expression, fish don't know that water's wet. I had no idea what I was learning from my parents. All I knew was it was such a happy home, very optimistic. I learned much later that the homes of Holocaust survivors were often very despairing and dark. But mine was sunny and forward-looking, and they easily talked about the Holocaust every time I asked, because I was obsessed with what they had been through. Never cried, very, very calmly relayed questions, answers to my questions, how they managed, how they survived. I didn't know that my mother had been rich until I was 11 years old, because my grandmother was in the basement of our house preparing food for Passover. And I said, I don't understand why you and mommy are such terrible cooks. And she said, it's because we had people at home who made our food. And I ran upstairs and said to my mother, you had people who worked for you at home? And that's how I discovered that they had been wealthy, because all they talked about was how lucky they were to be in Canada. And I, as a parent, came to understand what they had taught me and what it meant to me to come from that background. And that was that there is no sense of entitlement, that this is a country of opportunity. Don't expect anything. Work very hard, be true to who you are, and with hard work, it will be as good a life as possible. That was the first thing. The second thing was that you never forget how lucky you are, and how much that gives you a responsibility to help people who aren't. And again, these weren't conversations we had. They were just lessons that I picked up from what I saw was important to them. They never had to say you have to do really well in school, but I knew I did, because I was making up for what they didn't have a chance to do. I found out many years later that my father, I found a document that my mother gave me, that my father was scheduled to have a judge's exam in October of 1939. I had no idea, because they never talked about what they didn't get to do. They just talked about how great it was to be in Canada. My decision to be a lawyer was directly because my father wasn't allowed to practice law. As soon as we came to Toronto, he went to the Law Society and said, what do I have to do to become a lawyer? Because he had learned English in order to work for the Americans as a lawyer in Stuttgart, where I was born. And the Law Society said, you can't practice law, you're not a citizen. So I remember my earliest memory, 4 years old in Canada, saying, fine, then I am going to be a lawyer. And then I spent the next 15 years going to weddings and bar mitzvahs, and people said, so what are you going to do when you grow up, dear? And of course, what that meant was you're going to get married and have children. Well, yes, of course, I was Jewish. I knew I was going to get married and have children. But I was also going to be a lawyer. And they just pinched my cheeks and said, that is so adorable. But I meant it. I was going to be. And the only two people whose opinions I cared about were my parents. And they said, why not? So I didn't know girls weren't supposed to do things, because in my house, you could do anything. So I went to law school. I became the lawyer he couldn't be. He died before I graduated from law school. Never got to see any of that. But my mother did. And for the next 40 years, I became more and more in awe of who they were, and how everything they had been really was the reason why I was who I was. I liked who I was. I never tried to fit in with a society that was Toronto was very different when we came to Canada in the 1950s. And the legal profession was very different. But I was me, and they made me feel comfortable being me. And I never tried to dress like anybody else. I never tried to talk like anybody else. I just certainly didn't think like anybody else. But they made me fearless about being who I was. And the world was very generous and opened its arms and opened its doors. And look, here I am, staying true to who they thought I was, who they wanted me to be, and who I really am. Now that's nothing that I thought about when I was little. That's why I say these are things you understand as you get older and you become a parent yourself. How those influences, those encouragements, those strengths that you had from seeing who they were and how how they just coped and were resilient and never bitter and never angry. I came to understand that that was very exceptional. I am not that exceptional, but I stand on their shoulders, and there's no question that I wouldn't be where I was without the things they taught me and the people that they were. Now, having said that, then you have to be lucky in who you marry. You have to be lucky in the fact that the person you fell in love with when you were 19 is the person you're married to 52 years later, who still wants to stay with you, and that your children are healthy. And all of that is just muzzled to a large extent. I really believe that things happen to people they have no control over. So I have now that I'm a few months away from retirement, a very lively sense of how lucky I've been all the way. I always knew it, but now that it's ending, my judicial life that started 45 years ago, I really can hardly believe that I've had a chance to do all of this stuff. And all of it, by the way, Rosalie, you can tell your students, because I planned none of it. Like when you're an immigrant, a refugee in Canada, you don't sit there and say, other than I wanted to be a lawyer, and then I'm going to chair a labor board, and then I'm going to be a judge, and then I'm going to go to the Supreme Court of Canada. It's like Sammy Kahn, the songwriter, who said, when somebody said, what came first, the words or the music? He said, the phone call. So somebody said, you want to be a family court judge? Sure. You want to run a labor board? Okay. Want to do a royal commission? Gee, that sounds like fun. And it was all because I didn't have a place I wanted to end up. So I did whatever came along that sounded interesting. And it was, and everything taught me something else. Teaching at McGill, meeting people like you, Rod, Irwin, those great academics, that everything helped me to do better the next thing that I did. Wow. So it's a long answer, but it
was a beautiful answer and extremely powerful. I'm just going to correct you on one thing. You are exceptional. I want to go back to something that you just said in your answer, and I have heard you say it before, that you wanted to be a lawyer since the age of 4, which is not the top ambition for most 4-year-olds. But I've actually never read or heard you say that your childhood ambition was to be a judge. And while the two are related, they are actually quite different. And given that you were appointed to the bench at the age of 29, you have in fact been a judge most of your life, and your time as a judge has definitely eclipsed the relatively short time you spent as a lawyer. Do you feel that you should have answered the question at 4 that you wanted to be a judge rather than a lawyer? And are you happy that fate took your juristic background into the judicial arena?
You know, I know that Justice Cosman is on this call, and this will resonate with her. When I was asked to be a judge at the age of 29, I had wonderful friends in the legal profession. Lawyers in Toronto were really very, very generous to me and very encouraging and supportive. I mean, there was pregnant, and I had a baby, a 3-year-old, and I mean, it was adorable. Imagine a girl judge in the courtroom. I never saw another woman in a courtroom, and I never knew another mother who was a lawyer. So it was all kind of new. So when they asked me to be a judge, those lawyers said, you really don't want to go to the family court. It's the provincial court. It's like the bottom rung of the judiciary. And if you work hard, maybe you one day could be on the federal trial bench. And I said, and again, this is from where I came. I said, I don't even know any judges, and I'm 29, and they want me to be one. This is incredible, this honor. And how do I know whether I'll ever get a chance to do something like this again? This is wonderful. So I never dreamed of being a judge, because it was so far beyond anything that I would have ever thought. That when it came, I was struck by this amazing opportunity that Roy McMurtry, as the Attorney General, was giving me. I have to tell you, having been a family court judge for 7 years, that's where I learned to be a judge. Not only did I never regret anything I've left. Once I've left, I'm done. You know, it was wonderful to be there, but I never look back and say, oh, if only. What's the point? So as a family court judge, I learned how to listen, more even than listening to clients across a desk. And I learned to judge. It was family court. I was deciding for 7 years whether to take other people's children away. And I had two at home, two babies at home, a 3-year-old and a newborn. And I was deciding whether to take their children away. So instantly, I understood the role of humility for a judge and how important that is. This isn't about you. Secondly, you don't look at their lives from the top down, from your privilege is a very unpleasant word these days, but I was privileged. I had 2 healthy children and I had a healthy husband, and his whole salary went to paying for somebody who was helping me at home. So I had to learn to listen to them and their experiences and their lives with their families, and not judge it from my family and my lucky experiences. So by the time I got to do family court, after 7 years, Court of Appeal, Supreme Court of Canada, where you don't see witnesses anymore, I understood these stories, that these court cases are stories of people's lives, and I saw and heard those stories. It was easier than being a lawyer in a way, because when you're a lawyer, somebody's sitting across from you and saying, I need you to fix my life. And you only hear that one side. When you're a judge, you hear both sides. And you have to learn to hear what both sides are saying. And there are 2 sides to most issues. So all of that made me, I think, a far better judge when I got to do a different kind of judging. So I never dreamed of that possibility. But if I hadn't started where I started, on the first rung of the judicial ladder, I don't think I would have been as sensitive a judge to what I'm hearing as I am now.
One of the things you just said, Rosie, is that when you became a judge, you didn't know any other women judges, female judges.
I didn't know any judges. I didn't know any judges.
And I'm sure the same was true when you went to law school. You didn't really know lawyers, let alone women lawyers. I'm sure there weren't many other women in your law class, and I can imagine none or very, very few women professors. We hear so much about the importance of mentorship these days, and you did it without any mentors outside your family. How has this experience influenced you as a mentor for others?
Oh, I've had mentors. They weren't women at the beginning because there weren't any mentors to have, but I never, the word mentor wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. Mentors was a category that got written about in the 70s, but I was already I was done by the 70s. But I had very encouraging teachers in high school, very encouraging professors, very supportive professors in law school. They took care of me. My father got cancer just before my second year exams in law school, and the professors at the University of Toronto Law School helped me find an articling job because I wasn't even going to look, because I didn't think I was going to get through 3rd year. And he died just before I finished, but they propped me up. They helped me. I didn't know it was called mentors in those days. And then I practiced law with one lawyer who was great downtown. I didn't even think in terms of, did I need mentors? But what I did know, because it had been so, I'm embarrassed to say this, it wasn't hard to be one of the only women in those days. I had a support. My mother lived 5 minutes away. My husband was an academic and he came home every day to do his work so he could be with the kids. And of course we had the housekeeper. So I knew, because it was easy for me, but because I'd had clients, and because there were so many women starting to come into the profession, I wanted to be a cheerleader for women in the profession, because it was so much fun for me, so great, so intellectually stimulating, so professionally satisfying, that I wanted to do everything I could to make sure that they knew that there was a future for them in the legal profession. So that's how I became somebody who reached out. I always looked over my shoulder to see if there was somebody that I could help, because generosity is it's a momentum that you can fly on. It's just so much easier when there are people around you who believe in you. So I did it. Now, as I got older, I met many women mentors, many women who were just planting these gardens of women in all different fields to make sure that they could grow. And many of those mentors, there were many mentors of these women who were men. So in the early days, it was a gender collaborative approach. Men and women wanted women to succeed. I think, honestly, once the numbers got bigger, and it wasn't just a few who didn't seem like a threat, once it got to be 50%, and the question then felt to many like, oh my God, I've got to share this pie. They don't want just a piece. They want access to the whole pie. I think that's when people started making it tougher for people who were different, women, later minorities, because it's hard to give up what you thought you were entitled to. And these women came along and said, wait a minute, why is this your profession? Why isn't it mine too? Now, we've gone a long way, but we still haven't really, I don't see as many women who are general partners, managing partners of law firms. The academic and judicial worlds, I think, are way ahead. Many female chief justices, many women on the, 40-something% of the judiciary in this country is female. But the legal profession is really quite resolute in saying this is the way we've always done it and you have to adjust to us. So they'll make some accommodation, but they don't realize that when women leave in droves, and men too, they really should be trying to hold on to these wonderful people whose humanity doesn't let them stay in an environment that they find too hard on their souls. So, I mean, that's talent that you're losing. What's wrong with more talent in the profession? So I think that's going to be an ongoing struggle because it's a business. It's not just a profession. I remember when I did the Royal Commission, I said to a group of vice presidents of human resources, why don't you have more women in your, I mean, it's human resources. Everybody says women are better with people. And one of them said, well, we had one once and it didn't work out. I said, what? You had one once and it didn't work out? Have the men ever had a heart attack and been away for months? Well, yes. Did you ever say, that's what happens with men? So women who didn't perform spectacularly became metaphors into what was otherwise normal. So we're chipping away at all of that. Huge, huge progress in so many ways, but a lot more to do. But women like you, Rosalie, the fact that you've been a hugely successful, brilliant intellectual in a law school sends a signal to women. All women send signals in all of the professions. You're comfortable doing what you're doing. You don't feel you have to choose between being a professional and having a rich personal life, a textured one that includes friends and family. I think a lot of young women in our profession feel they have to make choices like that. And I think that's sad because the men don't have to. And why should the women give up the things that make life so much more meaningful for so many people? They don't have to, but they shouldn't feel that they can't choose.
You just said that, we've been chipping away. In fact, you've been chipping away to a large extent. We owe a lot of this chipping away to you. You have been awarded the prestigious Honorable Walter S. Tarnopolsky Award for Human Rights by the Canadian Bar Association and the International Commission of Jurists. Your citation reads that you're a jurist whose entire life has revolved around the cause of human rights. There are many facets involved in fighting for human rights. How does one do it as a judge? After all, a judge is restricted to dealing with the cases that come before her, the facts of those cases, and the applicable law.
I don't think judges fight for anything. I think, it's one case at a time. We don't put signs outside the courthouse saying, we really like to hear human rights cases. And I have, as it turns out, looking back on my professional life, done a lot of work in human rights, just because those opportunities have come. But there isn't a day that I haven't loved what I've done in a courtroom. Not one day in almost 45 years. I've loved criminal law, copyright law, tax law, labor law, commercial law, black letter law, contract law, tort law, and of course the Charter of Human Rights, Charter of Rights and Freedoms. I love it all. And do I fight for it? I write what I believe is the right answer. It tends to be an approach to rights that are that is more expansive and inclusive than restrictive. But that's what I think constitutional documents demand. You interpret them in a way that gives them the widest possible scope and meaning. I don't think that's revolutionary. I think we've been hearing that from judges around the world who interpret constitutions for years. There is a recent move to be more restrictive in the way rights are interpreted. I think that's oxymoronic. To interpret rights strictly means to simply not understand the whole purpose of rights. You can't always have the rights you want. I mean, the beauty of our charter, I think, is Section 1, which says the rights can be limited if the limitation is justified in a free and democratic society. So it's not absolute. It has to be seen as the widest possible scope, subject to the ability of the government to say, we are justified in limiting this in these circumstances for these reasons. So it's a very sane model, I think, of constitutional interpretation. But human rights, there was a time, remember, in the 90s when human rights was a bad word. Human rights was activism, judicial activism. I never understood that. We fought a world war to protect human rights. That's this generation. We are in the shadow of what happened to the world when human rights were ignored or abused. So I think somehow, even though we were put on the defensive for being pro-human rights in the 90s, it always struck me as bizarre because the people, to me, who should have been on the defensive were the people who weren't in favor of expanding human rights to as many people as possible. And of course, I understand where that comes from. People don't like change that changes their status quos. But while some people hold on to a status quo, it means that other people aren't getting access to it. So human rights means not keeping people from what they're otherwise entitled to because of their race, religion, gender, color, where they were born. Their values are only a problem for Canada if they come up against our core values. But our core values are pretty strong and resilient, and there's lots of room. So how did I come to this? I don't know. I just learned by listening to people who were smarter than I was, reading a lot. Most of what I learned about people, I have to tell you, came from novels. Novels, really good literature, taught me about human nature. And taught me because I can't tell you why I was fixated on the 19th century Russian novels. They were so depressing, but I saw what life was like. And then Les Miserables, I discovered Hugo when I was a teenager. And I saw how unbearable it was for people. And it wasn't for me. that felt wrong. That was the birth of a sense of injustice, not the Holocaust, because it wasn't described to me that way at all. But reading good literature about how the world could oppress, I thought, I want to be a lawyer so that that doesn't happen. So have I been fighting for human rights? No, but because I'm not a fighter. Have I been fearless in protecting the values of human rights that I think are central to this country? Yes. And has that been controversial at times? Of course. Do I regret it? Not for a second.
And neither do we, Rosie. We don't regret anything you've done or written. I want to move on to talk a little bit about some of the judgments that you've had to grapple with that have to do with religion and religious freedoms. Some of them involve the Jewish religion, like the Brooker and Markovitz case,
Right.
and the Jewish divorce. But there's also R versus NS involving a Muslim's woman's right to wear a niqab while testifying, the Alberta and Hutterian Brethren, which concerned the right not to have a photo on a driver's license because of a belief that it contravenes the Second Commandment. In some of these cases, you side with or even pen the majority opinion, and others you dissent. But regardless of your position in these cases, you've once said so beautifully that a judge needs to have an open mind, not an empty one. So how can you comment on how these types of cases, do they pose special or different challenges for you, given how important your religion and your being Jewish plays in your life?
Being Jewish is very important in my life. There's no question. And it's made me, I think, aware of how important religion is to people. But the first two paragraphs of Brooker, as you remember, say, this is a country that values diversity and people's rights to different points of view, and different identities, including religion. But that those views and those rights stop at the door of other people's rights. So there's so much of Judaism, I think, that's in me, that I take from Judaism a sense of compassion. I mean, I would say I'm more secular than religious, but I'm very culturally attached to being Jewish. I have a deeper sense of history because I'm Jewish. I think I have a much more acute sense of outsider status, what that means, what discrimination means, because being Jewish means you've experienced it more than many, and that's why anti-Semitism today is such a concern to me, all discrimination. But when I approach these cases, I put my own views aside because it's not about me. And I look at them from the point of view of the people who are arguing. So in NS, for example, it was a Muslim woman who wanted to be able to testify. She was a complainant in a sexual assault case and wanted to be able to wear her niqab. And the question was her right to come to court as a Muslim woman based on her religious identity and wear the niqab more important than the right of an accused to see her to protect his right to make full answer in defense? And it was an 8-1 decision, and I was the only one who said that protecting her religious right, it was a question of protecting her right to come to court, because if she was denied the right to wear a niqab, she would not come to court and she would not be able to present what everyone else in this country is able to do, and that is a complaint about a criminal act that she alleged took place. It's always a balance in a religious case. In the Hutterian case, it was a question of the government of Alberta deciding that not for security reasons, for identity theft purposes, they wanted to be able to take photographs of people for a facial data facial recognition bank that they had. The Hatarians said, we aren't allowed to have our photographs taken. And if you deprive us of, if you deprive our religious rights by making us take pictures, we won't be able to take pictures, and therefore we won't be able to drive, even though the government had always let them drive without without their photograph being taken. So the effect of the law was to deprive them of the ability to keep their communities separate because they didn't want to be able to go into the community. Again, that was a dissent, but I thought there was no justification on balance for depriving them of the right to retain their religious identity and the integrity of their religious identity in the face of what wasn't a security issue, identity theft, when hundreds of thousands of people in Alberta didn't even have driver's licenses. So how do you balance? And who's to say who's right? But that's just the way it struck me. But in Brooker versus Markowitz, a Jewish man did not want to have to pay damages for refusing to give his wife a get for 15 years, notwithstanding a contract that he had made when he granted the decree nisi, because he said his religious freedom entitled him not to have to pay damages. He had the right not to give her a get. And I wrote this time for the majority. That's always nice when that happens, that his religious beliefs did not override her right to equality. And women in Canada have the right to get a divorce, notwithstanding religious impediments. So did I get it right? I don't know. But it's the way I saw what the issues were. Now, identity is such an important question in Canada. I think Canada probably has done identity better than any Western country. Because we understand that multiculturalism means allowing people to enter the mainstream based on who they are, based on their differences. The Americans have the melting pot assimilation. Well, you can't assimilate if you don't look like, if you're Black, you may or may not, maybe assimilation if necessary, but not necessarily assimilation. You can't treat everyone the same, which is the premise of the melting pot. Everyone's the same. If you are in a wheelchair and you're treated the same as an able-bodied person, you don't get into a building without a ramp. So Canada understands that. That's the way it interprets equality. That was the gift of the Royal Commission for me, being able to think about that and develop that theory. Because it meant that if you allow people to come into the Canadian mainstream based on who they are, so they don't have to give that up, except to the extent that it's a harmful identity for the rest of the population, people feel at home in Canada more than they do everywhere else, because they can be who they are and still be Canadian. I think that's our gift to the world.
Well, speaking about that, I think we are very lucky in Canada with our Supreme Court. You yourself have called it the leading constitutional court in the world. Is there another Supreme or High Court in the world that you admire, and why?
Oh, yes. I admire, Israel. The Israeli Supreme Court protects its integrity, independence, the democratic rights of the Israeli public in the face of the most difficult rhetorical challenges I've ever heard. And notwithstanding the constant criticism, they have kept their jurisprudential dignity, and they're a model for the world. So Aaron Barak, their former Chief Justice, said when he was talking about terrorism, and we were starting to deal with those issues, you have 2001, we had 2001, 2002, 2003. It was constant, and yet they protected people's rights. And we modeled our terrorism jurisprudence on what they did, because notwithstanding the daily assault, they were under the court-protected rights. So I admire the Israeli Supreme Court. I admire the South African court. because they developed a brand new, from whole cloth. They took a new constitution, starting with sending it back to Mandela and saying, your constitution isn't good enough, you have to amend it. They built on our constitution and expanded it even further. I'm an admirer of the European Court of Human Rights. I like the German Constitutional Court. Actually, you know, the Australian, New Zealand, there are great constitutional courts. I was a big admirer when I was in law school, a bigger admirer of the American Supreme Court. It won't surprise you to know that I thought that the Warren Court was fantastic. And I used to look at our court when I was in law school with its Section 91. That was constitutional law. Is this within federal jurisdiction or provincial jurisdiction? Really? And the Americans were just interpreting their provisions so robustly. And then we got our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and we started interpreting the Constitution very robustly, and they less robustly. So I like the people on the American Spring. I'm friends with quite a few of them. But institutionally, I find almost all of the Western constitutional courts have conversations with each other and look to each other more than they do currently to the American Supreme Court, because it's taken a different approach to rights. Maybe because it's 200 years old and they're locked into that jurisprudence. The rest of us are post World War II constitutions. So we had more freedom to develop our rights, and we had the benefit of everything that they had done in developing theirs for 200 years. But we just moved on, and they had different constraints that they were dealing with.
So I happen to be so glad that you mentioned the South African Constitutional Court. I make my students watch in the first day of class a tour of the South African Constitutional
Court. Yeah, with Albie's art. Albie Sachs's art.
Everyone in this audience should watch it. It's half hour, and it's just the most uplifting thing in the world.
Albie's one of the only people who ever came into my office and said, "Yep, this is okay." He wasn't overwhelmed, but it looked totally normal to him.
Your office is overwhelming. I want to take a question from the audience who said that there seem to be so many similarities between you and Ruth Bader Ginsburg when it comes to be pioneering women in the law and with women's and human rights. And I might add that you wrote an incredibly touching piece in the Globe and Mail shortly after her passing. And I guess I want to ask you, what have we lost in our loss of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and anyone out there to replace her?
You know, she became a symbol in a very understandable way. As the approach to rights came under increasing assault in the United States, it became more important for a lot of people to be able to see their court protecting what they thought was a very important part of how they saw America. And in the dissent, starting, I guess, in around 2012, she increasingly and very forcefully protected perspectives that were disappearing from the rest of the court, the majority of the court. So she kept alive the possibility, in the same way that Claire Leroux-Dubé kept equality on the table in the 90s when, in a substantive way, when it seemed to be slipping off in deference to a more criminal law court in the 90s. She did us a favor by keeping that as a placeholder and making sure that we didn't forget it. So Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the judges who joined with her became a symbol for ensuring that the rights that were at the beginning of the development of the American dream, right when America started, were still there and flourishing in a different way, in a dissenting way maybe, but still there for all to see. So she kept that dream alive, I think, for a lot of people. And she was also fearlessly feminist. And remember, feminism was a bad word. Feminism meant bias. Feminism was the politicization of the role. It was judges who were really legislators because they were feminists. Well, she just kind of said feminism means being fair to everybody, including women. And men should be feminists too, because if you're not in favor of, if you don't understand how differences have excluded women, then you're not fair in the way you think about rights. So she made feminist, I think, a less scary word for a whole lot of people, and made them understand that it is not an ideology. It is just a goal of making sure that the world openly accepts women's differences in a way that allows them the range of choices everyone's entitled to.
So, Rosie, I could go on with this delightful conversation for a lot longer, but I'm getting this sign from our organizers. So I'm going to beg the audience's indulgence and just ask actually one more question. Someone in the audience asked if to compare the mandatory retirement age in Canada with the no retirement age of Supreme Court justices in the United States. I'm not going to ask that question, but rather say that, well, we are in Canada, and therefore, I guess a little bit unfortunately, you are going to be retiring this coming July 1st. What's next? Might we expect a memoir?
I have no idea what's next. I am afraid of an ahura, so I'm not going to say what I plan, because I never do plan anything. I hope it's good health. I hope it's lots of time with family. I hope it's lots of time with books. I look forward to a life without homework. I have had homework since I graduated from law school 50 years ago, every single night, 7 nights a week. So I'm looking forward to that. But I also want to say that you've raised a very good point. I feel lucky to be in a country that has mandatory retirement. It's very important to have turnover. Nobody is indispensable. We all come, we make a contribution, we hope, and then somebody else comes in and makes a different kind of contribution. You had your turn, and time's up. Time to move on and let someone else have a chance. And isn't that great that it's so seamless and so without drama? Who's going to go? When are they going to go? And without the politicization that comes with that. Will they go when this government's in power? Will they go when that's government in power? So I am going on July the 1st. There are going to be fireworks on Parliament Hill, maybe for my birthday, maybe. So here I am. I made it to, touch wood, I made it to almost 75 in a country that let me stay doing my job until I was 75 years old. And Kanai Nahora with luck, with the people I love close at hand. So thank you for this wonderful opportunity, Rosalie. This was such a joy, as I knew it would be, because you're such a joy. And I'm so proud of our friendship. Thank you.
Well, thank you. This has been a wonderful honor for me and privilege, and a lot of fun. And now I'd like to turn things over to Justice Suzanne Costam.
Well, what an absolute treat it is to listen to both of you. You're both so brilliant and dynamic and interesting. And I also could have listened all night. And I have to say, the fact that you're both two Jewish women makes it all the more special. When Louis called me to thank you both, I was thrilled and also considered it a big honor. Rosalie Jukier was my law school professor, and you spoke a little bit about mentoring and mentors during your discussion. And she was someone who was this brilliant, dynamic, dedicated professor, and someone who I could totally relate to as a Jewish woman. And she was pregnant with her third child for part of the time that I was in law school. And so it was very meaningful for me that she was my professor, and she's been there for me over the years. And I've heard her speak many times and interacted with her many times over the years. And she's always as eloquent and fabulous as she was tonight. So thank you very much, Rosalie. And Justice Abella, although I don't know you personally, you also, unbeknownst probably to you, had a huge impact on my life. because when I was in law school, those were the years that you were the visiting professor at McGill. And you spoke to our entire class. I believe we were in first year. And this is actually very consistent with something that you said earlier on in the speech. You were wearing, I think, purple leather boots that went above the knee. They were the coolest things in the world. And you spoke about your career as a lawyer. It was about 1989. And having done labor law and family law and criminal law and civil litigation. And you were completely different than anything that I had ever pictured that a lawyer or judge had to look like, or the career that a lawyer or judge had to have, because everybody around me that was a lawyer had had a very linear career. They had gone to one firm and stayed there for 30 years or more and had practiced in one area of law. And your speech and your whole presence was profoundly impactful for me, because it made me feel that I could not fit the mold of whatever it was I thought that a lawyer was supposed to look like or was supposed to do. So you were a very, very important person in my life. And, you know, there's people, and I'm referring now to both of you, who when we hear you speak, not only what you say, but how you say, and your whole being leaves a lasting impact. And I am sure, even though it was too short, I'm sure for me and for everybody else here tonight, that just as both of you have had a major impact on my life, and I'm really not exaggerating, that your words will remain with everybody that was in this room, and in this room virtually, I should say, and that everybody is living much more enriched and enlightened. So thank you so very much on behalf of the many, many people who were lucky enough to hear you this evening.